Jayla Johnson sits frozen in her business class seat, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as passengers whisper and stare. The flight attendant who refused her a blanket now stands paralyzed, phone in hand, face drained of color. "I'm sorry, Captain," she stammers, "I didn't know she was the CEO's daughter." Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. This journey of discrimination, power, and justice is one you won't want to miss, so hit that like button and subscribe to make sure you catch all our true stories of courage in the face of injustice. Jayla Johnson had been looking forward to this moment for months. At 16, she was already making waves in the tech world with her innovative robotics designs, earning her a spot at the prestigious National Youth Technology Summit in San Francisco. As she settled into her business class seat on the Atlanta to San Francisco flight, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of nerves and excitement. This was her first time traveling alone on a plane, a milestone her father Isaiah Johnson, the self-made CEO of Phoenix Innovations, had reluctantly agreed to after an emergency board meeting prevented him from accompanying her. "You've earned this, baby girl," he had told her that morning, adjusting the collar of her blazer before dropping her off at the airport. "Just remember what I always tell you about navigating spaces that weren't built with people like us in mind. Stay calm, stay dignified, document everything," Jayla had recited, the mantra familiar from years of her father's careful coaching on moving through predominantly white spaces. "That's my girl," Isaiah had smiled, though the worry never quite left his eyes. "Call me when you land." Now, as Jayla showed her boarding pass to the flight attendant at the entrance of the plane, she noticed the subtle shift in the woman's expression, the flicker of surprise, followed by the tightening of her smile. The attendant, whose name tag read Bridget Cooper, checked Jayla's ticket not once but twice. "Business class is to your right, seat 3A, Bridget finally said, her tone noticeably cooler than it had been for the middle-aged white businessman who had boarded just before Jayla. Jayla nodded politely and made her way to her seat, hyper-aware of the eyes following her movement. At 16, she stood out among the primarily older, primarily white business class passengers. She was used to this, the stares, the assumptions. Just last year, during the state robotics championship, one of the judges had asked if she was lost when she approached the registration table. His face when her team took first place was a memory she still treasured. As the cabin filled, Jayla observed the interactions around her. The warm smiles Bridget offered to other passengers. The casual chatter. The immediate response when a white woman in seat 4C asked for a pre-flight water. When the plane finally took off, Jayla settled back and tried to focus on her upcoming presentation, pulling out her tablet to review her notes. About 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin temperature dropped noticeably. The air conditioning seemed to be blasting directly over Jayla's seat, and she rubbed her arms, wishing she'd worn a heavier sweater. She noticed several other passengers reaching for the blankets typically provided on these longer flights. Looking around, she didn't see any in her seat pocket or overhead compartment. As Bridget passed by with the beverage cart, Jayla raised her hand slightly. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Could I please have a blanket? It's quite cold." Bridget barely paused as she arranged drinks on her cart. "I'm sorry, blankets are only provided for overnight flights," she said, already moving to the next row. Jayla frowned, confused. She had flown with her father enough times to know this wasn't standard policy. Still, she didn't want to make a scene. Perhaps there was a shortage, or perhaps policies had changed. She returned to her tablet, trying to ignore the goosebumps forming on her arms. Just minutes later, however, she couldn't help but notice when a white businessman across the aisle, his seat was 3B, raised his hand and asked the same Bridget for a blanket. "Of course, sir," Bridget responded warmly, immediately retrieving a neatly packaged blanket from a compartment and handing it to him with a smile. "Is there anything else I can get you?" Jayla felt a familiar sinking feeling in her stomach. She had experienced this type of treatment before, the different rules applied depending on the color of your skin, but it never stopped hurting. For a moment, she considered letting it go. Her father always taught her to choose her battles wisely. But the chill in the cabin was becoming uncomfortable, and the principle of the matter bothered her deeply. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the call button above her seat. This time, a different flight attendant responded, a young man named Trent Wilson, according to his name tag. He had sandy blonde hair and a practiced customer service smile. "How can I help you?" he asked. "I asked for a blanket earlier but was told they're only for overnight flights," Jayla explained calmly. "But I just saw another passenger receive one. I'm quite cold, and I'd appreciate one as well." Trent's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, we have limited supplies," he said. "I'll check with my colleague about the situation." Instead of walking away to consult with Bridget, however, he lowered his voice. "Look, you're making this into something it's not. We're just following protocol here." Jayla noticed heads turning in their direction. A white elderly woman in seat 4B shook her head disapprovingly. "This entitled generation," she said, loud enough for several rows to hear. "Always making demands." Heat rose to Jayla's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not making demands. I'm simply asking for the same service provided to other passengers." Trent's expression hardened. "I'll see what I can do," he said curtly, walking away without any apparent intention of returning with a blanket. As Jayla sat back in her seat, feeling the burn of embarrassment and anger, she remembered her father's words, "Document everything." Discreetly, she took out her phone and activated the voice memo function, placing it in her lap. If this situation continued, at least she would have a record. Over the cabin PA system, the captain's voice rang out, "Good afternoon, folks. This is Captain Warren Hayes speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Weather in San Francisco is looking clear, and we expect to arrive on schedule. The seatbelt sign has been turned off, but we recommend keeping your seatbelts fastened when seated. Enjoy your flight." Jayla shivered, partly from the cold and partly from the growing tension she felt. What should have been an exciting journey to her technology summit was quickly becoming yet another lesson in how the world treated young black women differently, even in business class, even when they'd earned their seat. 20 minutes passed, and neither Trent nor Bridget returned with a blanket. The cabin remained uncomfortably cold, especially in Jayla's section. She watched as a third passenger, an older white woman several rows ahead, requested and promptly received a blanket from Bridget. Each time the flight attendant passed by Jayla's seat, she seemed to deliberately avoid eye contact. Jayla pressed the call button again. She wasn't going to be ignored or treated differently without at least understanding why. This time, Trent returned, his expression making it clear he was annoyed by her persistence. "Yes," he asked, without the, "How can I help you?" he'd offered the first time. "I'm still waiting for that blanket," Jayla said, keeping her voice level despite the frustration building inside her. "I've now seen 3 other passengers receive blankets after I was told they're only for overnight flights. Could you please explain the actual policy?" Trent glanced quickly at the passengers around them, then leaned in slightly. "Look, it's company policy, all right? I don't make the rules. We're running low on supplies and need to prioritize." "Prioritize based on what criteria?" Jayla asked, the lawyer's daughter in her emerging. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like the criteria might be problematic." The businessman across the aisle, the same one who had received a blanket without question, looked up from his laptop with a scowl. He was in his mid-40s, with an expensive watch and tailored suit that screamed corporate success. "Some of us are trying to work here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Is a blanket really worth disrupting the entire flight?" Jayla turned to him, maintaining her composure. "I'm simply requesting equal treatment, sir. I don't think that's disruptive." The man rolled his eyes. "Here we go with the race card," he muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Several nodded in agreement. Jayla felt a wave of isolation wash over her. This was exactly what her father had warned her about, how quickly situations could turn, how readily people dismissed legitimate concerns by reducing them to playing the race card. She reached for her phone, wanting to call Isaiah, but realized they were at cruising altitude with no signal. Instead, she pulled out her tablet again and opened a notes document. With methodical precision, she began typing the details of each interaction, times, names, exact words used. If she couldn't reach her father now, she would at least have a complete record to share later. As she typed, she noticed another flight attendant, her name tag read Sarah Martinez, watching the situation from the galley. Unlike Bridget and Trent, Sarah's expression held a hint of discomfort, perhaps even sympathy. But she made no move to intervene. The white woman in seat 3C, directly across from Jayla, had been quietly observing the entire scenario unfold. Her name was Catherine Williams, though Jayla wouldn't learn this until later. For now, she was just another face in the sea of passengers who seemed content to watch a young black girl be treated unfairly. Catherine shifted in her seat, appearing to contemplate saying something. Their eyes met briefly, and Jayla thought she detected a flicker of concern. But then Catherine looked away, returning to her book without a word. The temperature continued to drop, and Jayla found herself shivering visibly now. She pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders, trying to generate some warmth. The contrast was stark. All around her, passengers lounged comfortably under their airline-provided blankets while she sat cold and increasingly angry. This wasn't the first time Jayla had faced such treatment. Last year, during a school field trip to the Museum of Modern Art, a security guard had followed her group of black students closely while white student groups wandered freely. When her AP physics teacher announced partners for the semester project, Jayla was the only student left without one until the teacher reluctantly paired her with himself. Each incident was a paper cut, small enough to be dismissed individually but collectively forming a painful pattern that couldn't be ignored. From the cockpit, Captain Warren Hayes contacted the cabin crew through the intercom system. "Bridget, what's the situation in business class? I'm getting reports of a disturbance." Bridget glanced back at Jayla before responding in hushed tones, "Nothing we can't handle, Captain. Just a passenger with unreasonable demands. We're managing it." Jayla continued documenting everything, the screen of her tablet reflecting in her determined eyes. She might be alone on this flight, but she wasn't without resources or resolve. The daughter of Isaiah Johnson hadn't been raised to accept discrimination quietly, she'd been raised to challenge it strategically. 3 hours into the flight, the situation had evolved from uncomfortable to unbearable. Jayla had made a third request for a blanket, this time directly to Bridget as she passed with a coffee service. The response was firmer and more dismissive than before. "As my colleague already explained, we're following company policy," Bridget said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "If you continue to disrupt the flight with these requests, we'll need to take further action." The implication was clear, the threat of further action hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jayla had heard similar warnings before, had seen how quickly situations involving black people could escalate when authority figures felt challenged. But she also knew her rights as a passenger. "I'm not disrupting anything," she replied evenly. "I'm a paying customer requesting the same service others are receiving. That's not disruption, that's equality." The businessman in seat 2C, Derek Palmer, according to the email Jayla glimpsed on his screen, closed his laptop with an exaggerated sigh. "Some people just need to make everything about race," he announced to no one in particular, though his words were clearly meant for those around him. "When I was starting out, nobody gave me handouts or special treatment." Several passengers nodded in agreement. The elderly woman from 4B chimed in, "In my day, we had real problems to worry about, not blankets on airplanes." Jayla felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the unique mix of anger, hurt, and resignation that came with these encounters. She reached for her phone again, desperately wishing she could call her father. Isaiah would know exactly what to say, how to navigate this minefield of prejudice while maintaining dignity. With no signal at 35,000 feet, Jayla returned to her tablet, continuing to document every interaction with methodical precision. Times, names, exact quotes, all recorded with the attention to detail her father had taught her. If it happens again, make sure you have receipts, Isaiah always said. People will try to gaslight you, make you question your own experience. Don't let them. Catherine Williams in seat 3C had been watching the entire scene unfold while pretending to read her book. As a white woman in her early 40s with a successful career in education, she recognized the injustice happening before her eyes. She had witnessed similar scenarios before, had even caught herself perpetuating some of the same biases in her early teaching years. But knowledge came with responsibility, and her discomfort grew with each passing minute. Catherine debated offering her own blanket to Jayla. It would be a small gesture of solidarity, an acknowledgement that the treatment the young woman was receiving was wrong. But something held her back. Perhaps the fear of inserting herself into a situation that didn't directly involve her, or worse, the unconscious desire to avoid being associated with the problem passenger, as Jayla was clearly being labeled. So Catherine remained silent, her inaction speaking volumes. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop even further. Jayla could see her breath fogging slightly in the air, or perhaps that was just her imagination, heightened by the chill that had settled into her bones. She rubbed her arms vigorously, trying to generate warmth through friction. In the cockpit, Captain Warren Hayes was receiving updates about the situation in business class. The reports from Bridget painted Jayla as increasingly disruptive, demanding special treatment and causing discomfort among other passengers. Without context or first-hand observation, Hayes was forming a picture that aligned with too many stereotypes about young black women: loud, aggressive, entitled. Keep an eye on the situation, he instructed Bridget through the intercom. If it escalates further, we may need to issue a formal warning. Back in the cabin, Jayla continued shivering as she typed on her tablet. The notes document had grown extensive, detailing each interaction with timestamps and exact quotes. If nothing else, she would have a complete record to share with her father, the airline, and if necessary, social media. This wasn't just about a blanket anymore, it was about the principle, about standing up against the casual discrimination that tried to make her feel small, make her feel less deserving. As a black girl in predominantly white spaces, Jayla had learned early on that she would be held to different standards, subjected to different rules. At 12, she was the only student in her advanced math class asked to show additional work to verify her answers. At 14, she was stopped and questioned by security at a high-end department store while shopping for a dress for her father's company gala. Each incident left a mark, a lesson about navigating a world that often viewed her through a lens of suspicion and bias. But Isaiah had also taught her something else, that her dignity wasn't negotiable, that standing up for herself wasn't just her right but her responsibility. Every time you accept unfair treatment without challenge, he would say, you make it easier for them to do it to the next person who looks like you. So Jayla continued documenting, continued advocating for herself in the face of growing hostility. The blanket had become symbolic, a small thing that represented a much larger issue. And she wasn't going to back down. 3.5 hours into the 6-hour flight, Jayla had reached her limit. The cold had become truly uncomfortable, her fingers stiff as she continued documenting the situation on her tablet. She had witnessed 5 more passengers receive blankets without question, including another businessman who boarded after she did. "Excuse me," she said firmly as Trent passed by her seat. "I'd like to speak with the senior crew member, please." Trent's expression shifted from annoyance to something closer to concern. This wasn't going away as he'd hoped. "I'll see if she's available," he replied, disappearing toward the front of the cabin. A few minutes later, an older woman with short blonde hair and a senior crew member pin approached Jayla's seat. Her name tag read, Diane Reynolds. "I understand you have a concern about our blanket policy," Diane said, her tone professional but with an undercurrent of impatience. "As my colleagues have explained, we have limited supplies and distribute them according to company guidelines." Jayla took a deep breath, centering herself before responding. "Ms. Reynolds, over the past 3 hours, I have observed at least 8 passengers receive blankets after I was told they're only available on overnight flights. When that policy suddenly changed, I was told you had limited supplies and needed to prioritize. Yet the supply seems adequate for every passenger except me. I'm wondering what factors are determining this prioritization. Diane's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you suggesting our crew is discriminating against you? I'm stating facts about my experience, Jayla replied calmly. I've documented each interaction with timestamps. She held up her tablet. I've also been recording audio of our conversations, which is legal on interstate flights according to federal law. This caught Diane off guard. Her professional demeanor slipped momentarily, revealing genuine alarm. Recording without consent is against our airline policy, she said quickly. I'll need to confiscate your phone and tablet for the remainder of the flight. That would be a legal seizure of my property, Jayla countered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. And according to your own airline's published non-discrimination policy, which I reviewed before boarding, you're obligated to provide equal service to all passengers regardless of race, gender, age, or other protected characteristics. The elderly woman in seat 4B had been listening intently and chose this moment to interject. If she's being so disruptive, why not just move her to economy? Some of us paid good money for a peaceful flight. Derek Palmer from seat 2C chuckled. Probably got her ticket through some diversity program anyway. Merit doesn't seem to matter much these days. Jayla felt her chest tighten. The comment stung, but she fought to maintain her composure. This was exactly what her father had warned about, how quickly situations could escalate, how readily people showed their true colors when they thought they had the upper hand. She recognized the beginning symptoms of an anxiety attack, the slight dizziness, the quickening pulse, the sensation of the cabin closing in around her. Breathe, she reminded herself. Just breathe. And then, unexpectedly, a voice cut through the tension. She's right, you know. All eyes turned to Catherine Williams in seat 3C, who had finally broken her silence. I've been watching this entire situation unfold, Catherine continued, her voice gaining confidence. This young woman has been denied service that every other passenger who asked has received. I counted 8 people myself. And yes, I noticed they were all white. Diane looked flustered. Ma'am, I assure you that's not. I teach organizational ethics at Berkeley, Catherine interrupted. And what I'm seeing is a textbook case of disparate treatment. If you're not providing blankets based on standard policy, then what criteria are you using? Because from an outside perspective, it appears highly problematic. A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers processed this unexpected development. Some looked uncomfortable, others defensive. Jayla felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who had finally spoken up. Over the intercom, Captain Hayes's voice broke through. Diane, what's the status in business class? Do we need to intervene? Diane glanced up at the intercom speaker, then back at Jayla, clearly trying to assess how to handle the situation. Everything's under control, Captain. Just addressing a passenger concern. But the situation was far from under control. As more passengers tuned into the unfolding drama, opinions began to polarize. Some voiced support for Jayla, questioning the obvious discrepancy in treatment. Others doubled down on the difficult passenger narrative, suggesting she was causing unnecessary trouble. Jayla continued to document everything, her hands steady despite the turmoil inside. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, stay calm, stay dignified, document everything. So what do you think about this situation? Was Jayla right to stand her ground, or should she have just let it go to avoid conflict? Comment number 1 if you believe she was absolutely right to demand equal treatment. And comment number 2 if you think she should have handled it differently. This is exactly the kind of everyday discrimination that often goes unchallenged because people fear being labeled as difficult. While we watch this situation unfold, hit that like button if you've ever witnessed or experienced something similar, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories that expose the reality of racial bias in America. Now, let's see what happens when Captain Hayes finally decides to get personally involved. Will he make things better or worse? The tension in the business class cabin had reached a breaking point. After Catherine Williams's unexpected intervention, several other passengers began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the reality of what they were witnessing becoming harder to ignore or justify. Diane Reynolds, the senior flight attendant, seemed caught between maintaining the crew's united front and addressing what was increasingly appearing to be a clear case of discriminatory treatment. Over the intercom, Captain Warren Hayes's voice came through again, this time with a note of finality. "Diane, I'm coming back to assess the situation myself." A ripple of reaction moved through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged concerned glances, while others, particularly those who had been dismissive of Jayla's complaints, looked vindicated, as though the captain's intervention would surely put this troublesome girl in her place. Jayla took another deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. She had dealt with authority figures before, had learned through painful experience how they often defaulted to upholding the status quo rather than addressing injustice. But she also knew her position was unassailable, she had documentation, she had witnesses, and most importantly, she had truth on her side. Captain Hayes appeared a few minutes later, his commanding presence drawing all eyes in the cabin. He was a tall man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the final authority. His expression was stern as he approached Jayla's seat, Diane hovering anxiously behind him. "I understand there's been some kind of issue about a blanket," he asked, his tone making it clear he considered this beneath his attention. Jayla met his gaze directly. "Captain Hayes, for the past 3.5 hours, I have been repeatedly denied a blanket while watching numerous other passengers receive them without question. When I asked for an explanation, I was given contradictory policies and thinly veiled threats." Hayes glanced at Diane, then back at Jayla. "Young lady, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Our crew is well trained in customer service, and we don't discriminate against our passengers." "With all due respect, Captain, that's exactly what has happened," Jayla replied, her voice steady. "I've documented every interaction, including timestamps and the names of passengers who received blankets after I was told they weren't available." Hayes's expression hardened slightly. "Airlines have complex policies about resource allocation, which apparently change depending on who's asking," Catherine Williams interjected from across the aisle. "Captain, I've been observing this situation since it began, and what I've witnessed is troubling at best and discriminatory at worst." Hayes turned to Catherine, visibly surprised by another passenger backing Jayla's account. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not the only one who noticed," Catherine continued. "Several passengers have been watching this unfold." The young woman asked politely multiple times and was given different excuses each time, while other passengers received blankets without question. Murmurs of agreement came from a few seats, though many passengers remained silent, unwilling to involve themselves. Derek Palmer from seat 2C was not among the silent ones. "Captain, we're an hour and a half from landing," he said loudly. "Is this really the best use of your time? Some people just want to make everything into a federal case." Hayes seemed inclined to agree with Palmer, turning back to Jayla with an expression that suggested he'd already made up his mind. "Miss, while I apologize if you feel you've been treated unfairly, I'm sure my crew had their reasons. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding about available supplies or specific seat assignments. In any case, we're approaching our final descent preparation, and I need to return to the cockpit." Jayla felt a familiar disappointment settling in her chest, the realization that yet another authority figure was choosing the path of least resistance rather than addressing the actual issue. But she wasn't finished. "My name is Jayla Johnson," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the now quiet cabin. "Daughter of Isaiah Johnson, CEO of Phoenix Innovations." Hayes's expression didn't change immediately, the name hadn't registered yet. "Miss Johnson, your father's occupation isn't relevant to Phoenix Innovations," Jayla repeated, maintaining eye contact with the captain. "The tech company that acquired a 15% share in your airline's parent company, Transglobal Airways, last quarter. My father sits on the board of directors for your corporate leadership." This time, Hayes's expression flickered, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. Still, he wasn't ready to concede. I'm not familiar with every shareholder. You should be familiar with the ones who helped approve your recent fleet expansion, Jayla replied, drawing on information she'd heard her father discuss at dinner. The same expansion that included the new Airbus A350s with updated business class cabins, like the one we're currently flying in. The cabin had gone completely silent. Even Palmer was watching with newfound interest, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by calculation. Hayes was clearly reassessing the situation, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down completely. Miss Johnson, even if what you're saying is true, our policies apply equally to all passengers, regardless of their connections. Then I'd be happy to discuss those policies in detail with my father when we land, Jayla replied evenly. Along with the complete record I've kept of today's interactions. I'm sure the board would be interested in how those policies are being applied, selectively. Catherine Williams watched this exchange with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. The young woman was impressively composed, but Catherine couldn't help but notice the underlying problem. It had taken the revelation of Jayla's connection to power for her concerns to be taken seriously. Without that connection, would anyone have listened? Hayes seemed to be having similar thoughts, his confidence visibly wavering. I'll look into this matter personally, he finally said, his tone notably more conciliatory. If there's been any misunderstanding, we'll certainly address it. What I'd like, Jayla said clearly, is to be treated with the same respect and service as every other passenger on this flight. Nothing more, nothing less. Hayes nodded stiffly. I'll speak with the crew immediately. He turned and walked briskly back toward the cockpit, Diane following close behind with a worried expression. Jayla watched them go, then turned her attention to her tablet. The in-flight Wi-Fi had been activated, and she quickly composed an email to her father, attaching the audio recordings and notes she'd compiled. She didn't elaborate much in the message, just the bare facts of what had transpired and a note that she was handling it but wanted him to be aware. As she hit send, she couldn't know that this simple email was about to trigger a seismic shift in the power dynamics at 35,000 feet. Back in the cockpit, Captain Warren Hayes settled into his seat, his mind racing. The confrontation with Jayla Johnson had left him unsettled, his initial dismissiveness giving way to a growing concern. If what she claimed about her father was true, and something in her confident demeanor suggested it was, this minor customer service issue could have major repercussions. Give me a minute, he told his co-pilot, pulling out his phone and connecting to the plane's secure Wi-Fi. A quick search for Isaiah Johnson Phoenix Innovations brought up immediate results, and Hayes felt his stomach drop. Isaiah Johnson wasn't just the CEO of a successful tech company, he was a tech industry titan whose innovative security software had revolutionized digital banking. Phoenix Innovations was indeed a major shareholder in Transglobal Airways' parent company, with Isaiah himself sitting on the executive board. More concerning for Hayes was the discovery that Johnson had recently been appointed to the airline's Customer Experience Committee, specifically focusing on diversity and inclusion initiatives. This is bad, Hayes muttered to himself, scrolling through Johnson's impressive biography. Photos showed a distinguished black man in his early 40s with the same determined eyes as his daughter. One particular image caught Hayes's attention, Isaiah Johnson shaking hands with the airline's CEO at a recent press conference announcing their partnership. Meanwhile, in a luxurious San Francisco conference room, Isaiah Johnson was wrapping up an emergency board meeting when his phone vibrated with an incoming email. Normally, he wouldn't check messages during a meeting, but seeing his daughter's name in the notification banner, he discreetly glanced at the screen. The subject line, Discrimination on Transglobal Flight 372, caused him to stiffen in his chair. If you'll excuse me for a moment, he said to the assembled executives, stepping out into the hallway to read Jayla's message in full. As he reviewed the detailed account and listened to snippets of the audio recordings, Isaiah's expression darkened. His daughter was one of the most level-headed teenagers he knew. If she said she was experiencing discrimination, he had no doubt it was true. The methodical documentation was exactly what he'd taught her: stay calm, stay dignified, document everything. Without hesitation, he dialed a number rarely used except for emergencies. Richard, he said when the airline's CEO answered, we have a situation on one of your flights that needs immediate attention. Back on the plane, the cabin crew had been summoned to an urgent meeting in the galley. Captain Hayes, his face grim, addressed them in hushed tones. The passenger in 3A is Jayla Johnson, daughter of Isaiah Johnson. Yes, that Isaiah Johnson, the one who sits on our parent company's board, he explained, watching understanding dawn on their faces. She's been documenting what she describes as discriminatory treatment regarding blanket distribution. Several passengers have corroborated her account. Bridget's face paled considerably. Captain, I didn't know who she was. I was just following. At this point, it doesn't matter what you thought you were following, Hayes interrupted sharply. What matters is that we have a situation that could severely damage this airline's reputation if not handled properly. Trent looked defensive. She was being difficult from the start. That's not how other passengers described the situation, Hayes cut in. And quite frankly, whether she was difficult or not isn't the issue. The issue is that she asked for the same service others received and was repeatedly denied. Sarah Martinez, who had observed the situation without intervening, spoke up quietly. She was treated differently, Captain. I saw it happen but didn't say anything. That's on me. Hayes ran a hand through his hair, stress evident in every line of his face. We need to fix this. Now. Before. He was interrupted by the cockpit communication system. Captain Hayes, urgent message from headquarters. Hayes excused himself and returned to the cockpit, where his co-pilot handed him the receiver with a concerned look. It's the CEO's office, he whispered. While the crew scrambled to address the rapidly escalating situation, Catherine Williams had moved to the empty seat beside Jayla, introducing herself properly. What you did took courage, Catherine said sincerely. I should have spoken up sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. Jayla accepted the offered blanket Catherine had finally decided to share. Thank you for speaking up at all. Many people never do. I teach ethics at Berkeley, Catherine explained. I lecture my students about bystander intervention, about the responsibility to speak up when witnessing injustice. And yet when the moment came. She shook her head, disappointed in herself. It's always harder in practice than in theory, Jayla said with wisdom beyond her years. My dad says that's why we have to practice courage in small moments, so we're ready for the big ones. As they talked, Jayla shared some of her experiences navigating predominantly white spaces as a young black woman, the constant pressure to be exceptional just to be considered equal, the exhaustion of having to choose which battles to fight, the isolation of often being the only one in the room who could see the problem. For Catherine, it was an education more powerful than any academic text she'd encountered. I'm going to do better, she promised, both to Jayla and to herself. Their conversation was interrupted when Derek Palmer awkwardly approached from seat 2C. The businessman who had earlier dismissed Jayla's concerns now wore an expression of calculated contrition. Miss Johnson, he began, his tone notably more respectful, I believe we got off on the wrong foot. I wasn't aware of your connections. I'm in venture capital myself, primarily tech investments. Perhaps we could exchange cards. Your father's work in cybersecurity is revolutionary. Jayla regarded him coolly. Mr. Palmer, my connections shouldn't determine whether I'm treated with basic respect. But thank you for the offer, I'll pass. Palmer retreated, rebuffed but clearly reassessing his initial judgment of the teenager he'd so quickly dismissed. Even the elderly woman from 4B seemed to have a change of heart. You know, she said loudly to her seatmate, though clearly intended for Jayla to overhear, I met Isaiah Johnson at a charity gala last year. Brilliant man, very generous. Donated a fortune to scholarships for underprivileged youth. The sudden shift in how people perceived and treated her wasn't lost on Jayla. It was a phenomenon she'd witnessed before, how the revelation of her father's status transformed her from angry black girl to impressive young woman in the eyes of those who had previously dismissed her. The experience always left her with mixed emotions, vindication tinged with sadness that her humanity alone hadn't been enough to command respect. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes was receiving the most uncomfortable phone call of his career. "Yes, sir, I understand the gravity of the situation," he said, sweat beading on his forehead as the airline CEO spoke from the other end. "We're taking immediate corrective action." "Yes, sir, I'll address it personally. Of course, customer experience is our top priority." When he finally hung up, Hayes sat for a moment, processing the conversation. Then he stood, straightened his uniform, and prepared to return to the cabin with a new approach to Jayla Johnson, one that recognized both her legitimate complaint and the considerable influence she wielded through her father. The power had shifted dramatically at 35,000 feet, and everyone on board was about to feel the change. "All cabin crew to the cockpit immediately," Captain Hayes announced over the intercom, his voice strained with urgency despite his attempt at a casual tone. "Secondary crew, please cover cabin service in the interim." As Bridget, Trent, Sarah, and Diane hurried to the cockpit, passengers exchanged curious glances. Such a gathering mid-flight was unusual, and coming on the heels of the confrontation with Jayla, its purpose seemed clear to many observing the drama unfold. In the confined space of the cockpit, Hayes addressed his crew with barely contained tension. "I've just spoken directly with Richard Mercer, CEO of Transglobal Airways," he began, watching their expressions shift from concern to alarm. "Apparently, Isaiah Johnson, yes, the Isaiah Johnson whose daughter is sitting in 3A, called him personally about the treatment she's received on our flight." Bridget's face had lost all color. "Captain, I had no idea who." "That's precisely the problem," Hayes interrupted sharply. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic dignity and respect. The fact that it took a call from a board member to get your attention speaks volumes about the culture we've created." The crew fell silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "Mr. Mercer has made it abundantly clear that this incident could have serious repercussions for everyone involved," Hayes continued. "Isaiah Johnson isn't just any shareholder, he's spearheading the airline's diversity and inclusion initiative, which is now receiving a first-hand demonstration of exactly why it's needed." Trent shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly does this mean for us?" Hayes's expression was grim. "It means our handling of this situation will be under intense scrutiny. It means there will be an official investigation into discriminatory practices. And it means our jobs could very well be on the line." Sarah spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Captain, I want to acknowledge that I witnessed what was happening and didn't intervene. That was wrong, and I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences come from that failure." Hayes nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his features. "That accountability will be noted in my report." He turned back to address the entire crew. "Now, here's what we're going to do to attempt damage control." While the emergency meeting continued in the cockpit, a subtle but profound shift was occurring in the business class cabin. Passengers who had earlier been dismissive or hostile toward Jayla were now reassessing their positions, particularly as whispers about her father's identity and influence spread throughout the section. Derek Palmer had retreated to his seat, but his attitude had transformed dramatically. After his failed attempt to network with Jayla, he'd done a quick internet search on Isaiah Johnson and discovered not only his impressive business credentials but also several articles featuring him on lists of the most influential black executives in tech. Now Palmer was frantically scrolling through his phone contacts, apparently checking if he had any connections who might help smooth over his earlier behavior. The elderly woman from 4B, who had loudly complained about Jayla's disruption, was now recounting to anyone who would listen how she had always supported diversity in aviation and had once taken a photo with Isaiah Johnson at a charity event she may or may not have actually attended. Catherine Williams observed this hypocrisy with a mixture of disgust and self-reflection. "It's remarkable how quickly principles shift when power enters the equation," she commented quietly to Jayla. "Though I suppose I'm not one to talk, given how long it took me to speak up." Jayla nodded, unsurprised by the sudden change in atmosphere. "My dad calls it the revelation effect. People treat you one way until they discover who you are or who you're connected to, and suddenly they remember their manners." "It's shameful," Catherine replied. But I hope you know that your handling of this situation has been extraordinary. Most adults wouldn't have maintained your composure under such pressure. I've had practice, Jayla said simply, the weight of that statement hanging in the air between them. Their conversation was interrupted as Captain Hayes emerged from the cockpit, his expression carefully composed as he made his way directly to Jayla's seat. The cabin fell silent, all eyes following his movement. "Miss Johnson," he began, his tone formally polite, "on behalf of Transglobal Airways, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the treatment you've experienced on our flight today. It falls far short of the standards we set for ourselves." Jayla met his gaze steadily. "Thank you, Captain Hayes. I appreciate the acknowledgement. We would like to offer you complimentary premium services for the remainder of the flight, including priority deplaning, access to our exclusive arrival lounge in San Francisco, and of course, immediate provision of any comfort items you require." He gestured, and Bridget immediately appeared with a blanket, premium headphones, and a selection of high-end amenity kits. Jayla looked at the offerings, then back at Hayes. "Captain, I don't want special treatment. I never did. All I wanted was equal treatment, the same consideration given to other passengers without question or explanation." Her words hung in the air, a powerful indictment of the fundamental issue that no amount of premium amenities could erase. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Hayes nodded, genuine understanding finally crossing his features. "That's a fair point, Miss Johnson. And one that will be central to the review process that will follow this incident." He paused, then added with surprising sincerity, "Your father should be proud of how you've conducted yourself today." As Hayes returned to the cockpit, Jayla's phone buzzed with an incoming text. Service had been restored as they began their initial descent toward San Francisco. The message was from her father. "I'm on my way. The CEO and I had a very productive conversation. You okay, baby girl?" She texted back quickly, "I'm fine, Dad. Just ready to be off this plane." His response came immediately, "You handled it exactly right. Documentation always wins. See you soon." Jayla smiled slightly, remembering a conversation from years ago when she'd first asked her father why people sometimes treated them differently in stores, at restaurants, in first-class airport lounges. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. "Because some people think the color of your skin tells them everything they need to know about you," Isaiah had explained, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Our job is to prove them wrong, not with anger, but with excellence. And to document everything when they still don't get it." As the plane began its descent toward San Francisco, Jayla looked around at the business class cabin, at the passengers who had witnessed or participated in her humiliation now studiously avoiding her gaze, at Catherine who had eventually found her courage, at the crew members whose treatment of her had transformed not because they recognized her humanity but because they discovered her influence. The blanket now lay across her lap, a hollow victory that represented something much more significant than physical comfort. It represented a battle she shouldn't have had to fight in the first place, one of countless such battles that would mark her path through a world still struggling to see beyond its biases. But she had fought. She had documented. And she had won. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their final approach to San Francisco International Airport. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. On behalf of Transglobal Airways, I want to express our commitment to providing an excellent experience for all our passengers, regardless of background. We value diversity and inclusion as core principles of our service." Jayla exchanged a knowing glance with Catherine. The damage control had begun in earnest. But words without actions were just empty promises, and both women knew that the real test would come in what happened next. As the plane touched down at San Francisco International Airport, a noticeable tension hung in the air of the business class cabin. The usual routine of seatbelts unlocking and passengers standing to retrieve overhead items was tempered by an unusual quietness, a collective awareness that something significant had occurred during their journey. Bridget approached Jayla's seat with a forced smile. "Miss Johnson, Captain Hayes has arranged for you to deplane first. If you'll just follow me when we reach the gate." Thank you, but that won't be necessary, Jayla replied calmly. I'm happy to exit in the normal sequence. Bridget looked uncomfortable, clearly under instructions to provide preferential treatment. The captain insists. It's our way of apologizing for the misunderstanding earlier. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Jayla said, her voice firm but not unkind. It was discrimination. And treating me differently now doesn't address the underlying issue, it just reinforces it. Catherine Williams, overhearing from the adjacent seat, nodded in appreciation of Jayla's principled stance. Over the past hour, they had continued their conversation, moving beyond the incident itself to discuss broader issues of systemic inequality and the subtle ways bias manifested in everyday interactions. I teach a whole course on ethical leadership, Catherine had shared, but I've learned more from watching you handle this situation than from any academic text I've assigned my students. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, Catherine handed Jayla a business card. I meant what I said earlier. If you're interested in speaking to my ethics class about your experience, both today and in general, I think my students would benefit enormously. Jayla accepted the card with genuine interest. I'd like that. My dad always says individual stories have more power to change minds than abstract statistics. As they gathered their belongings, the shift in atmosphere around them was palpable. Derek Palmer, who had been loudly dismissive of Jayla earlier, now seemed eager to demonstrate his allyship. Miss Johnson, he said, approaching her seat with an ingratiating smile, I want to apologize for my earlier comments. They were completely inappropriate, and I hope you can forgive my insensitivity. My firm actually invests heavily in diversity initiatives, and if you're ever looking for internship opportunities in venture capital. Mr. Palmer, Jayla interrupted politely, thank you for your apology, but I'm not currently looking for internship opportunities. And if I might make a suggestion? Examine why it took learning my father's identity to recognize the inappropriateness of your behavior. Palmer's smile faltered, a flash of annoyance crossing his features before he managed to compose himself. Of course. Very insightful. Well, safe travels. He retreated to his seat, immediately busying himself with his phone. The elderly woman from 4B was similarly transformed, now smiling warmly at Jayla as though they shared some special connection. Such a bright young lady, she commented loudly to her seatmate. We need more articulate young people like her speaking up. Jayla maintained her composure, though Catherine could see the weariness in her eyes. The exhaustion that came from being the unwilling object lesson, from having her humanity acknowledged only after her worth had been validated by external factors. As the aircraft door opened and passengers began to deplane, Captain Hayes emerged from the cockpit to personally oversee the process. His eyes met Jayla's briefly, a complex mixture of emotions passing between them, his shame and regret, her dignified acknowledgement of both. Miss Johnson, he said as she passed, I want to personally apologize again for your experience today. Thank you, Captain Hayes, she replied. I hope something meaningful comes from this. I believe it will, he assured her, though whether this was genuine conviction or damage control remained to be seen. The jetway was lined with airline representatives, all wearing expressions of concerned professionalism. At the gate, a small contingent of officials waited, including what appeared to be senior airline management. But Jayla's attention was drawn to the tall, distinguished figure standing slightly apart from the group. Dad, she breathed, quickening her pace. Isaiah Johnson opened his arms as his daughter approached, enveloping her in a protective embrace. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought through countless barriers to reach his position of influence. His tailored suit and subtle designer accessories spoke of success, but the watchful concern in his eyes was purely paternal. You okay, baby girl? He asked quietly, studying her face. I am now, she replied with a small smile. But it was. I know, he said, his expression hardening slightly as he looked over her shoulder at the approaching airline officials. I heard the recordings. You handled it perfectly. The airline representatives approached cautiously, led by a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the Regional Director of Customer Experience. "Mr. Johnson, Miss Johnson," he began, his tone calibrated for maximum appeasement, "on behalf of Transglobal Airways, I want to express our deepest apologies for the inexcusable treatment your daughter experienced on our flight. I assure you, this incident doesn't reflect our company values or policies." Isaiah's expression remained impassive. "I'm sure the upcoming board meeting will provide ample opportunity to discuss exactly what your company values and policies are, and how they're actually implemented." He checked his watch. "But right now, my daughter has a technology competition to prepare for. Your CEO and I have already had a productive conversation about next steps." The director nodded rapidly. Of course. We've prepared a statement for the press." "Press?" Jayla asked, glancing around. As if on cue, several journalists approached from the terminal concourse, camera operators in tow. The airline had clearly hoped to control the narrative with a choreographed apology and resolution, but Isaiah's expression suggested he had other plans. "Mr. Johnson. CNN Business. Can you comment on the discriminatory treatment your daughter received on today's flight?" "Mr. Johnson. Is it true that flight attendants denied your daughter basic services provided to white passengers?" Isaiah held up a hand, bringing the barrage of questions to a halt. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms and beyond. "Today, my 16-year-old daughter experienced what too many Black Americans face daily: differential treatment based on the color of her skin. What makes her story unusual isn't what happened, but that she had the resources and support to document it thoroughly and the connection to power that forced accountability." He placed a protective arm around Jayla's shoulders. "The real question isn't why this happened to Jayla, but how often it happens to those without her advantages, those without a father who sits on the board, without the means to record their experiences, without the confidence that comes from knowing they have powerful allies." The journalist scribbled frantically, cameras flashing. "So yes, I'll be working with Transglobal Airways to address this specific incident," Isaiah continued. "But more importantly, I'll be leveraging my position to implement systemic changes that benefit all passengers, not just those with connections. Because what happened today wasn't an isolated incident or a few bad actors, it was the predictable result of systems that allow bias to flourish unchecked." As he finished speaking, Catherine Williams approached hesitantly from the gate area. "Mr. Johnson. I'm Catherine Williams. I was seated next to your daughter on the flight. I just wanted to say how impressed I was with her composure and eloquence throughout this ordeal." Isaiah extended his hand. "Thank you for speaking up, Ms. Williams. Jayla mentioned your intervention in her text. It made a difference." "Not soon enough," Catherine admitted. "I'm a professor of ethics at Berkeley, and I'm ashamed it took me so long to find my voice." A thoughtful expression crossed Isaiah's face. "Professor Williams, I'd be interested in discussing potential collaboration between your ethics department and Phoenix Innovation's new educational initiative. We're developing programs to address systemic bias in corporate cultures." "I'd be honored," Catherine replied, genuine interest in her voice. As they exchanged contact information, Jayla observed the scene with a mixture of pride and resignation. This was the world her father had taught her to navigate, one where justice often required leverage, where principles needed power behind them to effect change, where her personal dignity was constantly balanced against strategic considerations of when and how to fight. She was exhausted but unbowed, already thinking about how her experience might help others without her advantages. Perhaps that was the most meaningful outcome possible from a day that had begun with something as simple as a request for a blanket and had escalated into a moment of personal and public reckoning. As they prepared to leave the airport, Jayla received a text message from an unknown number. It was from Sarah Martinez, the flight attendant who had remained silent during her ordeal but had later acknowledged her complicity in the cockpit meeting. "I failed to stand up when I should have. I'm sorry. Your courage has inspired me to report other incidents I've witnessed. Thank you for your bravery." Jayla showed the message to her father, who nodded with understanding. "That's how change happens," he said quietly. "One person finding their voice at a time." 6 months had passed since the incident on Transglobal Airways Flight 372, and Jayla Johnson stood before a packed auditorium at San Francisco State University, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a simple request for a blanket. The audience, a diverse mix of students, faculty, airline industry representatives, and community members, listened intently as she spoke about her experience and its aftermath. "What happened to me that day wasn't unique," she explained, her confidence evident in every measured word. "What was unique was that I had the tools, support, and ultimately the connection to power that forced accountability. The question we should all be asking is, what happens to those who don't?" In the front row, Isaiah Johnson watched his daughter with unmistakable pride. Beside him sat Catherine Williams, who had become both mentor and friend to Jayla in the months following their shared flight. On Catherine's other side was Richard Mercer, CEO of Transglobal Airways, whose presence symbolized the company's commitment to the changes implemented in response to the incident. Those changes had been substantial, if overdue. Within weeks of the flight, Transglobal had announced a comprehensive review of its training protocols, resulting in a new mandatory anti-bias training program for all customer-facing staff. Developed in consultation with diversity experts, including Isaiah's team at Phoenix Innovations, the program went beyond the superficial diversity initiatives common in corporate America to address the root causes and manifestations of systemic bias. More significantly, Transglobal had established an independent oversight committee with real authority to investigate complaints of discriminatory treatment. The committee included representatives from civil rights organizations, industry experts, and importantly, ordinary passengers who had experienced discrimination firsthand. As for the crew members directly involved in Jayla's experience, the consequences had been mixed. Bridget Cooper and Trent Wilson had been terminated following an internal investigation that revealed a pattern of differential treatment extending beyond that single flight. Captain Warren Hayes had received a formal reprimand and undergone additional training but retained his position after demonstrating genuine commitment to change. And Sarah Martinez, who had acknowledged her failure to intervene, had become an outspoken advocate for ethical responsibility among crew members, often sharing her experience as a cautionary tale during training sessions. "Accountability isn't about punishment," Jayla continued, echoing a sentiment her father had often expressed. "It's about growth and systemic change. The goal isn't to vilify individuals but to transform the environments that shape their actions and decisions." The most unexpected development had been the creation of the Phoenix Scholarship for Transportation Equity, jointly funded by Transglobal Airways and Phoenix Innovations. The program provided educational opportunities and industry access to underrepresented minorities interested in careers in transportation, with a particular focus on leadership and policy roles where diversity was most lacking. The scholarship program was Isaiah's idea, Richard Mercer admitted during the panel discussion following Jayla's speech. He recognized that while addressing individual incidents is necessary, changing who sits at the decision-making table is equally important for long-term transformation. Catherine Williams, now serving as faculty advisor to the scholarship program, shared her perspective as well. "What happened on that flight forced me to confront my own complicity as a bystander. It's not enough to recognize injustice, we must actively work to disrupt it, especially when doing so carries personal risk." After the formal program concluded, Jayla found herself surrounded by students eager to share their own experiences and ask for advice. She listened attentively, recognizing in their stories the same patterns she had encountered throughout her young life: the subtle slights, the double standards, the burden of constantly having to prove one's worthiness. "Document everything," she told a young woman who described being consistently overlooked during class discussions. "Build your support network. And remember that your dignity isn't negotiable, even when others fail to recognize it." As the crowd thinned, Jayla spotted a familiar face approaching hesitantly: Sarah Martinez, the flight attendant who had texted her an apology months earlier. Sarah had become one of the most effective voices in Transglobal's reformed training program, her first-hand acknowledgement of silent complicity resonating with staff in ways that theoretical discussions never could. "Your speech was powerful," Sarah said, extending her hand. "I wanted you to know that what happened that day changed the trajectory of my career. I've documented 17 incidents of differential treatment since then and helped establish a protected reporting system for crew members who witness bias but fear retaliation for speaking up." Jayla smiled, genuinely pleased by this unexpected outcome. That's exactly the kind of systemic change we need, protecting those who want to do the right thing but need institutional support to do so safely. As the event wound down, Jayla, Isaiah, and Catherine made their way to the exit, discussing plans for the upcoming semester. Jayla would be starting her senior year of high school while simultaneously taking courses at Berkeley through a special enrollment program Catherine had helped arrange. "Your panel on corporate ethics last semester had the highest attendance we've seen in years," Catherine told Isaiah. "Students are still talking about it." "That's because he didn't sugarcoat the reality," Jayla said with a knowing smile. "Most corporate speakers come to campuses to recruit and polish their image. Dad comes to challenge assumptions and ask uncomfortable questions." Isaiah laughed. "Like father, like daughter. Speaking of which, how are you feeling about your flight tomorrow?" Jayla was heading to Chicago for a national STEM competition, once again traveling alone, a prospect that might have caused anxiety after her previous experience but now felt like an opportunity to measure progress. "I'm actually looking forward to it," she replied thoughtfully. "Not because I expect perfect treatment, but because I know my experience has helped create concrete changes that benefit others. That makes it worthwhile." The following afternoon, Jayla boarded her flight to Chicago. The difference was immediately apparent, not just in how she was treated, but in the visible diversity of the crew and the professional yet genuine warmth they extended to all passengers. The flight attendant who welcomed her, a young black woman named Desiree Taylor, was part of TransGlobal's newly established mentor program for crew members from underrepresented backgrounds. "Ms. Johnson," Desiree said with a smile of recognition as she checked Jayla's boarding pass. "It's an honor to have you on board. Your advocacy has made a real difference for passengers and crew alike." As Jayla settled into her seat, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The incident 6 months ago had been painful, humiliating, and exhausting, another tax on her spirit that no 16-year-old should have to pay. But the outcome had transcended her individual experience, creating ripples of change that would benefit countless travelers who would never know her name. When the flight attendant approached with the beverage cart, Jayla requested a glass of water and, after a moment's consideration, a blanket. It arrived promptly, without question or hesitation, a small moment of equal treatment that represented something much more significant. From her window seat, Jayla watched San Francisco recede beneath clouds as the plane climbed into clear blue skies. The journey ahead, both literal and figurative, would undoubtedly bring new challenges, new battles for dignity and respect. But today, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of knowing that systems could change, that accountability was possible, that her voice, amplified by privilege but rooted in truth, had made a measurable difference in the world. And that, she decided as the plane leveled at cruising altitude, was worth far more than a blanket. #The lesson. This story illustrates how systemic racism operates in everyday settings, where different rules are applied based on race. Jayla's experience highlights several crucial lessons. First, documentation is power. Her methodical recording of events created undeniable evidence that couldn't be dismissed. Second, speaking up against discrimination takes tremendous courage, especially when others remain silent or actively participate in the mistreatment. Third, privilege and connections shouldn't be necessary to receive equal treatment, yet they often make the difference in whether injustice is addressed. The most important lesson is that real change requires addressing systems, not just individuals. While firing discriminatory employees was necessary, the lasting impact came through policy changes, training programs, and diversity initiatives with actual authority. This reminds us that justice isn't just about punishing bad actors but transforming the environments that shape their behavior. Finally, Jayla demonstrates that maintaining dignity doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. By remaining composed yet firm in her stance, she showed remarkable strength that ultimately created positive change for countless others who would never know her name. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and struggled with whether to speak up? What would you have done in Catherine's position as a bystander? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If Jayla's story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that expose everyday injustice. These narratives help us recognize discrimination in its subtle forms and inspire action rather than silence. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how racial bias operates in seemingly minor interactions, because awareness is the first step toward change. Thank you for joining this important conversation. Remember, standing up for dignity and equal treatment creates ripples that extend far beyond the moment, and sometimes the quietest voice can have the most profound impact.